Today at the National Press Club, Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce returns to the position of Nationals leader earlier this year. He's also the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Barnaby Joyce with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's Westpac National Press Club address. I'm Andrew Tillett, Financial Review Political Correspondent and a Director of the Press Club Board. It's a bit of an unusual Press Club address today. Usually the politicians come to us at the club, but because of COVID restrictions we're actually beaming to you live from Parliament House and it's been conducted here under COVID-safe protocols for everyone at home. I can assure you of that. Anyway, today's guest is the Deputy Prime Minister, no stranger to Australian political scene, Barnaby Joyce.
Well, thank you very much. And yes, this is a new way to do business, and hopefully it's something we can move on from rather quickly. The speech today I'll try and give in three parts. Obviously, I'll refer to Afghanistan and COVID and infrastructure. After defeating Darius III in 330 BC, Alexander the Great went on to the Indus Valley, left and returned, left and never visited again, creating the vacuum which was the first noted iteration of the troubles of Afghanistan. It was not much past the shadow of Bucephalus leaving with Alexander's Bactrian princess Roxana that the remnant emigrant Greek Bactrians rose up and routed the post-Alexander Seleucid Empire and made their own Macedonian enclave. In this garden of divergent disruption was territory that was the moth to the flame of those who availed themselves of the cover of chaos in the vacuum between empires, between the immensity of the mountains and the tribes. From iniquity was perfected the resistance then practiced over the next millennium. Conquest, defeat, conquest, brutality, guerrilla freedom fighter, atrocity, zealotry, the Persians, Greeks, Mongols, Sikhs, British, Soviets, and now us. We've all had our time. But the purpose was just, and the outcome achieved, because we did not go in to conquer Afghanistan, but to extract and obliterate the evil that had taken root within, an evil taking sanctuary once more in the space between the mountains and the tribes, in the vacuum between powers, but we hope never returns to its former capacity. In 1998, with the bombing of the US embassies in Africa, came further intelligence of the substantial growth of this seed that had grown to become the corrupted, barbaric zealotry standing in proxy for Islam in Afghanistan. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his deputy, Osama bin Laden's religious interpretations were licensed for something that was as far away in logic as it was in distance and time to the 9th century Islamic scholarly works in algebra, trigonometry and chemistry. At that time, Europe was in the Dark Ages. All religions have their savage epochs, but this was 21st century pre-Enlightenment barbarism that made its intentions further cataclysmically evident when it drove two planes full of innocent people into the World Trade Center, another plane into the Pentagon, and in a metaphor for what was to happen next, the passengers of Flight 93 heroically stormed the cockpit of the fourth plane to offer their lives to save others. But to think that this time and these incidents were the totality of the events is a misunderstanding of what had grown in Afghanistan. The training camps of extremism had been operating long before the mastermind attacks on the US embassies in Africa and continued long into our engagement in Afghanistan. But our sustained engagement in Afghanistan destroyed, deterred and hopefully mollified the extremist terrorism which once grew. If others had not sought out and closed with the enemy, then the enemy would have come to our cities here on Australian soil. 39,000 Australian servicemen and women who served, hundreds who were maimed, 41 who paid the ultimate sacrifice, and now tragically hundreds more who in the torment have taken their own lives since, must receive the respect from their nation which is their due. Veterans Affairs, both Darren Chester and now Minister G, must bring these servicemen and women home, not just in body, but in mind, and with full acknowledgement of the solace carried by so many of their families. As people can wreak chaos, so can pathogens, as COVID-19 tragically destroys lives and economies. A pathogen that was not prescribed to a remote territory in a remote valley in a distant country, a pathogen whose nature took as no threat the powers of nations and was blind to philosophy, love and rhetoric. It knows nothing but has an ambit claim and range. We have only logic and reason to inspire what can curtail an otherwise mutating, catastrophic intrusion into the world that has taken so long to deliver the economy and balance we take as our right. The same logic draws from history that inaction would wreak havoc worldwide, possibly for centuries, as a highly virulent flu with a world that bereft of any mechanism of management. Maybe overstated, or maybe not, but do you want to roll the dice? A mutation away from a vastly more devastating near-apocalyptic episode. Some are so brave when blind to the crushing possibilities. Maybe the next mutation, that, polio-likes, kills the children first, would bring a morbid epiphany. In 2005, I gave a speech to rural doctors predicting that a pandemic would come in the next 15 years that would create massive intrusions into the operating of society by prescribing rights, introducing quarantine and restricting movement. I noted clearly that it would cause severe political and social angst. Here's my next prediction. It will happen again. As the world of a travelling population moves towards 10 billion people, moving back and forth between hemispheres, countries and religions, all of which are arbitrary lines of nonsense to a virus. So as man went to the moon, and we learned far and wide beyond that excursion, let's learn far and wide for our future beyond the experience of this pandemic. Studious understanding of this will be the plan that can save billions of lives in the future. For the alternate management of COVID-19, Labor has hung their hat on saying that in the past they would have done things differently. So where is this seminal speech from early 2020 clearly outlining this alternate path? Or is it merely the gift of 2020 hindsight in which we could all back every Melbourne Cup winner? If they have a prophetic gift, grace us with it now. Mr Albanese apparently could predict in the 1980s the 1980s advent of Viennetta ice cream, and he did this as a child in the 1970s. Why limit this portentous gift to confectionery? The Nostradamus of ice cream must be heard to enlighten our path forward. Tell us the number that they believe we should open the lockdown at, because they were unable to do that on the insiders on Sunday. Tell us the part of the Doherty study they don't agree with. In the complex brew of current circumstances, the biggest threat to this nation is the dramatic shift in geopolitical power and political philosophy, which is happening in our part of the world because of the Chinese Communist Party. Very importantly, not the Chinese people, who are the closest to this autocratic behemoth. So what are we to do in Australia? Our present circumstances here are vastly less consequential to the former regular venue of these historical challenges of projected power, Europe. Australia must become as strong as possible, as quickly as possible, and be ruthlessly pragmatic in how we achieve this task. Never as a threat, but as a deterrent, noting that the circumstances of the comparable power equation have definitively drifted against our favour. ANZUS, in its 70th year, is, in my view, more critical than it has ever been before. Genuine democracy and the associated general franchise of common and equivalent individual rights and freedoms in our region, and the rights of private ownership, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and so much more, are under pressure from unilateral totalitarianism, or its close cousins of the same. Your children could lose the liberties and freedoms granted to you as a birthright, granted to us, who indulgently never really stopped to recognise what an incredible gift that is when held in a genuine form by such a small group of people in such a small period of the human clock. Never really appreciated because we are so easily distracted by other things. We must be strong across all fields in Australia, and infrastructure is the vital catalyst for nearly all component parts of this quest. Cities don't build transport corridors. Transport corridors build cities. This nation does not have a city or town over 100,000 people in the 4,100 kilometres between Perth and Darwin, although one of the largest ports in the world is Port Hedland. The largest city away from the coast, is Canberra, and this has taught us that what seems eminently sensible now did not grow organically, but it was instead led by government. Since seed infrastructure is essential to inspire or accelerate the growth of cities off the coast, infrastructure, purely on a numbers game to attract investment, when the numbers are not there, works to the favour of the status quo. What is hailed as a bold, essential step in a capital is so often derided as pork barrelling in a region. When decentralisation, or as Minister Bridget McKenzie insists I use in my nomenclature, regionalisation, should have an equal weight in the consideration of investment. There are so many suggestions about alternate income sources, but in circumstances post-COVID, which has left us the nation's biggest debt in history, we must not merely aspire, but substantiate where the income will come from. In a world moving towards 10 billion people, food plays a major part and has a bigger future. Minister Littleproud has a role to play that is probably more substantial than any agriculture minister prior to him. We must build the infrastructure to capitalise on this agricultural opportunity. To grow it, you need water, which needs dams. You need the town or city to attract the vet or the agronomist, the school their children attend, the hospital they have a baby in. With a population close to 15,000 near the massive Fairburn Dam, Emerald in central Queensland's highlands is an example of dams supporting agriculture and inspiring decentralisation. This attracts social infrastructure, which attracts further local industry, supporting local mining, earning further export dollars and attracting yet more people. This initial investment in Fairburn Dam in 1972 was when the population was merely 650 people. At the same time, Collinsville had 2,000 people. It would never have stacked up if the purists had their way. Emerald would not exist as it does now. It is not chicken and egg, it is the seed and the tree. The Productivity Commission and so many other analytical bodies are good at predicting the here and now, but less capable of assessing potential. Rare earths, as I'm persistently informed by Minister Keith Pitt, are a massive opportunity and as an additional mining industry. Keith tells me we must not just dig them up and put them on a train to a port, but process them in Australia and use them to inspire the growth of the economy near the mine. We must borrow from Emerald's example and plant the seed infrastructure that broadens the economy, spreads the population and lifts the living standards. And just like the nuclear industry, Australia has most of the base material, but very little of the manufacturing capacity. It is in our interest to be a major global source of the metals that result from downstream processing of critical minerals. It is in the interest of all like-minded democracies that Australia is at least an alternate key provider. We have proved our reliability during the pandemic to the world with a resources sector that has not only maintained its operations but broken all export records last financial year. It is this type of reliability the world will need in coming years to underpin the common purpose of an advanced standard of living from the devices the world demands. It is in Australia's economic interest that the jobs and the economic boost that comes from this growth sector occurs here in Australia, or will be lost to other nations. The big winner will be Australia in general, and regional Australia in particular. Processing hubs in locations such as Gladstone, Dubbo, Mackay, Middle Arm at Darwin and Bustleton, which will utilise the skills of existing heavy industry workers. This is not a case of a just transition, but a case of expansion and growth. We're not a clumsy nation. we can do multiple economic tasks at the same time, maintaining our existing industry and building on our strengths. Naivety is the enemy in becoming internationally competitive. The fundamentals have to be right. Affordable, reliable electricity and gas, a skilled workforce, and a government regulatory system that does not whisper, don't bother starting. The green tape, red tape, other tape that makes the preamble the economic nemesis, choking investors' enthusiasm and whittling away any new small entrant of their funds. We will continue to invest in the Outback Way, an upgrade started by this coalition government. We will push on with this. The sealing of the third road, east to west, across our nation from Winton to Laverton. It is high time we do this, seeing we only have 2 sealed roads across our nation, east to west, at this time. By so doing, we will connect the critical earth precincts north of Alice Springs and the gold precincts around Laverton. It will create greater transport capacity for the massive beef industry along this new corridor and allow a greater connection for the current few who live and give them a basic article of 21st century living, a sealed road. To move food, you need rail, roads, ports and ships that are built not just for the task at hand, but for the future. You have to move opportunity around in a nation adroit to spread substantially from the southeast to the inland, from the east coast to the northwest coast. Currently, opportunity, expertise and population has proportionally moved little to where it was planted as colonial capitals over 200 years ago. It won't change unless we provide a similar infrastructure impetus to the same seeds as we planted here in Canberra early last century. An exponential growth of agriculture needs irrigation. A dry hectare at St George in Western Queensland produces $60 of wool, while an irrigated hectare produces $9,000 worth of cotton. You don't have to be Pythagoras to arrive at the conclusion of what is required. A brief lesson in the economy that underpinned ancient Egypt is as good reading as any as a starting point. Agriculture is now at record volumes and responsible for more than 1/3 of the increase in the latest GDP figures in the national accounts. It is a huge part of our economic history and has a global role to play in our economic future, so we must build the seed infrastructure to maximise our future economic benefit. We need water from where there is an abundance to irrigate the west of Queensland, where it does not have enough. Today, I announce that the North Queensland Water Authority, currently based here in Canberra, is moving to North Queensland, to Bowen, adjacent to where we are building Urana Dam, and the same region where we are building Hells Gate Dam, where we will start on the long-term nation-building task of expanding irrigated agriculture by moving a portion of the abundant resource of water west. This government has commenced the discussions to create the entity similar to what this nation had to develop the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme to start the long-term plan for this major agricultural expansion. Inland rail is a further part of the regionalisation plan. A 1,716 kilometre Brisbane to Melbourne corridor of commerce with the capacity to move trains 3.6 kilometres long at 110 kilometres an hour. We are building it. National leaders of the past set the vision. I negotiated the funding, Michael McCormack started the building and negotiated more funding, and now I will continue on pushing it through to completion for all of us. It is not a dream. This week, we announced $20 million of the $1 billion leg from just north of the New South Wales border to Gowrie, near Toowoomba. 117 kilometres of rail, 34 bridges, 900 culverts and 950 full-time employees. This comes after over 13,634 pages of merely the environmental impact statement from 71 scientists who have a combined 90 degrees with a combined experience of over 1,000 years. I hope that makes it clear where I say now, just get on with it. Today I've announced the business plan to continue the inland rail, a further 646 kilometres from Toowoomba to the industrial city of Gladstone. We are laying the ballast on the inland rail for the heavy-duty line that is part of it between Narrabri and Moree. Construction on the inland rail is complete between Parkes and Narromine, and we're underway on the Inland Rail between Moree to North Star. Australia has no Tier 1 construction firms. Construction firms which are capable of doing multi-billion-dollar projects by themselves. Most of Australia's major infrastructure projects, those worth over $500 million, are built by 4 foreign-owned Tier 1 construction firms. The 4 Tier 1 firms include basically 2 Chinese and 2 Spanish. But the link that we are building between the New South Wales border to Toowoomba will be using Australian Tier 2 construction companies. Australia must be instrumental in creating a Tier 1 sovereign capacity. We need to create a pathway for our mid-tier companies to evolve into Australia's next Tier 1s, companies to take on global multi-billion-dollar contracts. The Big Four accountancy firms that do so much of the government's assessment work are not Australian firms. Government must allow business studies and other required analysis to be done by Australian engineering firms, Australian accountancy firms and Australian environmental assessment firms. This must not be to the exclusion of international competition, but mindful of the risk-averse, some may suggest laziness, that runs to the big international names before seeing if that opportunity could be offered to domestic firms that could do the same job and possibly at a lower price. The Inland Rail, so I'm told by the local council at Narrabri, will bring about a doubling of the size of their town, with its connection at Narrabri to the Port of Newcastle. Inland Rail will be the seed for the construction of an inland port at Parkes. It will create jobs in manufacturing in Tamworth, in fact it already has, and produce steel at Whyalla. It will create new opportunities in Goondiwindi and grow the cities of Albury and Toowoomba. Right down into Victoria, the benefits will be seen. The Inland Rail will enhance economies at the bookends of Brisbane and Melbourne. Inland Rail should have been built years ago. It took this government to do it. If we spread the white-collar jobs, such as engineering, in planning, wider and into the regional towns, we will further incite the further growth and economy away from the capitals. But to do this, education must not just meet, but beat competition in our section of the world. Over a long period of time, the world has been leaving us behind in PISA scores, which is the assessment process. If you can do a job on a keyboard, that job can be done anywhere on the globe, and we must make sure our children in the future have jobs. The 2018 PISA ranking placed Australian students 16th in the world in reading, 29th in maths, 17th in science. The danger of sliding further is that we would lack the basic building blocks of phonics and grammar on the very subject matter tested for paying better, that provide better paying jobs. The capabilities required for such things as we need in engineering and the assessments and other processes, which is a white-collar part of building the Inland Rail. These building blocks are essential for authentic and competent understanding of the complex. I am very happy about the policy direction that Minister Tudge is taking to deal with this and take it on head on. In closing, back in September 2020, Norman Anderson wrote an article in Forbes magazine about major infrastructure projects. A wonderful fact about infrastructure, water, transport, power, SG, is that each project benefits thousands of people, and when connected to networks, protects and benefits millions. Like great businesses, projects are often the brainchild of a single, often highly unreasonable individual. These people don't let go, walking the fine line traced by energy, resourcefulness, persistence, and between visionary and crazy. The best projects offer not only a fascinating window into the future, but tell us a lot about who we are and who among us is going to make the future. I could not have said better myself.
Thank you, Mr. Joyce. Very nice to sort of finish up on the importance of education when you started with the history lesson of Alexander the Great. But look, one of the things you sort of mentioned early on in your speech about the geostrategic challenges, China and the importance of the US alliance. We've had Paul Keating today make some quite critical assessment of the government's current China position, saying the government's sort of leading us into a strategic dead end by needlessly provoking China and is more interested in trying to please the United States. I wonder if you could respond to that, please.
Well, Australia did not incarcerate over 1 million Uyghur people. Australia did not take over the South China Sea. Australia has not built military access roads into the north of India. Australia is, I think, has been a great nation, and not for one moment do I believe that we should antagonise, but we should most certainly defend. And we must most certainly create for ourselves a potent force that is, like other areas and other times, a mechanism that brings stability, because it's not worth the fight. And I think from a position of strength, we have a better position to bargain. I'd rather bargain from a position of strength than from the pulpit of poverty. And I think that's what our nation has to do. And we just have to be alive. We have to not be historically naive. We have to be completely alive to exactly what's happening in the globe. And that's the best way to keep ourselves free, and the best way to have our neighbours around us respect us.
At the same time, Australia is highly dependent on China for trade. You represent farmers as the National Party, and they've already sort of borne the brunt of some of these trade sanctions with things. Do you see that improving anytime soon? I mean, how do you sort of try and get tough with your banker, effectively?
Well, you pose the question another way. What liberties and freedoms of speech, as a member of the press, are you willing to give up? We see the inferences now. If you say the wrong things, it creates antagonism. But in Australia, you should have the right to say what you like. And you should have the capacity to trade with countries, as we do, but not have that overt influence on what we do. And so I think that it would be no different if we were weaker, and it would be no different if we said less, except that it would encourage that form of, and sometimes bullying and forms intimidation works. So we do have to stand up for ourselves, and I hope and pray that we go back to the relationship where it was mutually beneficial, the win-win situation, that both we economically develop and China economically develops, because we need a strong China to trade with, and we are a great beneficiary of that, but it is not at any price.
Thank you. We'll turn now to our media members for some questions. First up, Sarah Ison from the West Australian.
Thank you for your speech. Just on what you were saying regarding naivety in the global market, do you think there's a bit of that going on our end, considering how much we're relying on iron ore with what China's doing in Africa? Mm-hmm. That's obviously is buoying so much of what we're doing, but could that all blow up in our face? Do you see us needing to take a different tack with that? And secondly, you mentioned how important critical minerals are. There's a huge deposit of unexplored critical minerals in WA. Are we expecting some federal government dollars to be flowing to that state and others to help with, really capitalising on that very, very new and early kind of market?
Well, in Seriatima, yes, we do have risk in iron ore, and we see now the projects that the Chinese are developing in Guinea, which will have another alternate source. So we'll have Vale and Guinea, and yes, that could change the dynamics in the future. We don't want it to, but we have to be aware to it. We have to be alive to it. We can't basically close our eyes and pretend it's not happening. However, the sovereign risks in that part of the world are vastly greater than the sovereign risks here. And if you tie yourself to an area that you would have to say is vastly more unpredictable, then you put at risk exactly what you do with the product you need to use, which is iron ore. So I believe that Australia has a great future, and it's a win-win situation. Now, iron ore has underpinned the growth of Japan, underpinned the growth of Korea, has underpinned in a large way, in a large section, the growth of China. And smart people will realise that why stop a good thing? It's been working well and should continue to go on working for the benefit of all. In critical minerals, yes, there is a range of areas of precincts that we should be developing. I was talking to Senator Matt Canavan, talking about whether you're building a fighter jet, a submarine, an aircraft carrier. All that varies is the kilograms to the tonnes that you require to do this. And without them, you can't. And it's in everything we do, from solar panels through to mobile phones. In a mobile phone, there are 14 critical minerals and then other metals on top. for the devices that you all use. If you didn't have critical minerals, they just wouldn't work. And as we go forward, the world is going to ask for more and more of this product, because just like you determine what the world wants by seeing the boats that leave our ports, that is a great determinant of what the world wants. The boats that leave our ports, well, more and more, what they want from us is critical minerals.
Next questioner is Richard Ferguson from The Australian.
Thank you for your speech, Deputy Prime Minister. Obviously, state border closures have been most difficult for border communities like yours in your electorate of New England. If the premiers like Anastasia Palaszczuk and Daniel Andrews won't commit to opening borders, state borders completely to New South Wales by the end of this year, should they at least be committing to regional bubbles so that the regional communities that have suffered the most during these state border closures are allowed some sort of relaxation?
Greg Hunt and David Gillespie, you have to mention David Gillespie, are doing a great job at making sure we get the vaccine inoculations out as quickly as possible. We're now well in excess of 20 million inoculations, and 35% of Australia has had 2 inoculations. Now, that means that the way we are becoming more and more capable of dealing with the virus. And as such, we have to obviously progress towards changes in how we act. Now, Australia's economy cannot just go on borrowing money from overseas in perpetuity. It just doesn't work. It's not possible. And ultimately, everything we borrow has to be paid back by somebody. Your children and your grandchildren will be wondering where some of this debt came from. But that was what was before us. So yes, we do have to open up these economies, and an economy to work effectively has to work across state borders. My belief is that we are doing a great job at getting towards the 70 and 80%, so certainly the figures suggest that. And what you'll have is states not locking us out, but locking themselves in soon, because other areas will open up. And to Western Australia, say, well, on the east, there is no borders. We walk around, we do what we like, we've dealt with it. But if you make a decision that you're not going to let your people come visit us, we've got no problems with them visiting us, but you want to lock them up when you get home, that's a decision you made. And that transition will happen from locking people up to locking yourself in, and that will drive an opening of the Federation to what it's supposed to be.
What about the specific question, though, around border bubbles and regional communities? I mean, it seems... we live in a border bubble here, effectively, in the ACT and New South Wales. Have the state premiers sort of been a bit too blunt in how they've applied these sort of things?
Yep, they have, because restrictions should be based on epidemiology, not on arbitrary colonial lines from the 1850s. It's an absurdity. We had one case in the north of my electorate where a person's front gate was in Queensland, but their house was in New South Wales, and they had to get a permit. This is not logical, and this is why we need to move away from the parochialism of making a statement on behalf of your state to logic and making a statement on behalf of epidemiology. And as we go forward, there'll still be required at times action, but that action should be well targeted and directed to a certain area with a certain potency of outcome, and not this sort of broad brush, which is, when you think about it in Queensland, what are the people on the Gold Coast doing now? They'll be looking at Christmas coming and the money staying south. It's not a good outcome.
Anna Henderson from SBS.
Anna Henderson, SBS World News. Mr Joyce, you're a keen student of history. I'd like to hear your thoughts on what you think of the Taliban and the way they operate, and whether you think that the 3,000 places that have initially been set aside will be anywhere near enough to deal with the need of the people trying to flee their regime.
Okay, well, it's a fascinating question. And I hope that the Taliban, who, to be frank, we did have to rely on the evacuation of Kabul. And to be frank, Hamid Karzai is now dealing with them, and we do respect Hamid Karzai. And it may be 1,000 miles from what we believe is tolerable, but we have to look at it through the eyes of Afghanistan, and the alternative is ISK or Al-Qaeda. And as obscene as it is, they're vastly, vastly worse. Now, I listened last night to members of the Taliban talking about how we organised to go on with the test between Australia and Afghanistan in cricket. And I suppose deep down, I think, well, are the cricketers the problem? Should we be persecuting them? Or maybe we should consider whether this gives us some capacity to bring that regime, form of government, call it what you like, into a more tolerable situation. And of course, one of the sections of that is to be involved in international cricket, you must have a women's team. And you know, these are the sort of things I hope will bring it forward. But these are very, very, very early days, and we have to see what happens going forward. As far as places in Australia goes, the issue is our capacity to manage who comes in, to make sure that we don't fall down and bring a problem in that would, you know, if terrorism or something came in, would just set us back, because the Australian people would lose complete confidence in our capacity to manage that situation. Australia is a very generous country in who it brings to these shores. And in my own area, as you well know, what we have been doing with the Yazidis refugees is a classic example of but one. So I think it's a watching brief, and these things are dynamic, and decisions that are made are never made set in stone. They're made on the basis of facts, on the basis of capabilities, and reviewed and referred on, if required, as required.
If I may, sorry, just in terms of the government that you're a part of and the Syrian and Iraqi refugee commitment, if the capacity allowed it, pandemic willing, do you think that it should be a similar commitment here?
Well, it's, you know, I don't think there's an argument about the numbers. There's an argument about the capacity and your capacity to bring people in safely. I don't think Australia's ever been a nation that sort of arbitrarily is sort of partisan or bigoted and doesn't want immigration because it doesn't want immigration. It does, and we've grown, and our nation's grown on immigration. In fact, just about every person in this room, I would say everyone, if you reach back into their DNA, you will find either, as I said, convicts who didn't want to be here, protected by soldiers who didn't want to be here, followed by people from the Irish famine who were kicked out of the famine, the great hunger, the great shame, kicked out of their country, followed by wars where they were kicked out, First World War, Second World War, Southeast Asia. There's not a person who's probably watching this who hasn't got some connection to a trial, a tribulation, and a pain in another country which drove them to our nation. Therefore, we're all very, very mindful of making sure that we do the right thing. But we do the right thing to the extent of our capabilities, and to just devise arbitrary numbers without doing the diligence work behind that, I think is a failing. But if you find you have the capacity to do more later on, then why not?
Is there an opportunity to perhaps reimagine the humanitarian program and increase numbers, but on the proviso that people go to regional areas? I mean, the abattoir at Young used to get held up as an example of how it was able to keep going thanks to the helps of Afghan migrants.
Well, we note the work that especially the National, especially Minister Littleproud, has done, and the ag visa, which talks precisely to bringing people in from overseas to bring them into our nation. There are so many jobs in Australia that if there weren't people from overseas, they just wouldn't get done. It doesn't mean Australians won't do it, but they go through those jobs very quickly. They go from picking fruit into the packing shed and then to management as quickly as they possibly can. They go from packing offal in the abattoir to the boning room to management as quickly as they can. But then these jobs that are required to be done for the whole abattoir to work, for the whole packing shed to work, for the motels to work, for other things to work, it's in this global economy. That is a crucial part. And our Southwest, our Pacific Islander program, and now the ag visa, recognises that reality, which maybe 30 years ago people would say, oh, that will never happen. We just say one of the greatest ag packages you can give to people is to give them a job when they send their money home. And it's a win-win situation. Now, moving people to regional Australia, you have to encourage them and show them the jobs are there and the future's there. And if you do that, and I absolutely believe we can, even anecdotally in my area of Tamworth, with the construction of Dungowan Dam, is they're moving forward with in excess of a $500 million expansion in Biota chicken. As I say, in Tamworth, if Tamworth's not producing animal protein, you're probably not eating. 80% of your meat at Woolworths is killed in Tamworth. And their jobs, those jobs are going to be there. So we have no sense of animosity to anybody who comes to Tamworth. In fact, it's great because we know if they're there, the Indian community, the Philippine community, then our abattoirs are working and the eggs are being sent off and the chooks are being killed and the sheep are being killed and the cattle are being killed and the Australian people are eating.
But can I just flip that around? Is there perhaps an issue that will emerge in coming decades of that we rely on effectively a migrant underclass to do the jobs that Australians don't want to do?
I think there's always going to be people moving around, but when we say a migrant underclass, for a time, the world's dynamic, things change. And sometimes the seed of that change is the capacity for people to bring income into their nation. There's a time where you would have said, China could possibly be a migrant underclass, but now its economy's racing ahead. You could have said the same thing about Japan after the war, or Korea. Things are dynamic, and sometimes the seed of change is the capacity for people to bring money home and bring experiences home. And and that's once more, it's a statement by all of us that we've moved away from sort of the parochialism and bigotry that we say, well, if someone wants a job from overseas, and when you really flip it on its head, you're saying, well, you're not going to give it to them because they're from overseas. And that's a very peculiar statement.
Our next question is from Daniel Hurst.
Daniel Hurst from Guardian Australia. Mr Joyce, given the big role that you and the Nationals will play in the climate policy debate that's currently underway within the government, I want to ask a threshold question. Yeah. Do you accept that it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean and land, that human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that's unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years, that global warming of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees will be exceeded during the 21st century unless deep reductions in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades, and that the intensity, frequency and duration of fire weather events are projected to increase throughout Australia? Do you accept that's our best understanding of the science?
Well, I really don't like when questions are presented like that, because it sounds like you're at a baptism on behalf of your child denouncing Satan and all his works and all his deeds, and on and on and on it goes. If the question you ask me is, do I believe that humans have an influence on the climate? Yes, I do.
How much for you?
But look, and if you then walk into the frame of saying, I'm now going to grab you by the ear and make you comply with everything I say, and I won't do that because it's a free nation, and I can say and think what I like. And
so these are statements from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Have you read that report?
I've been through whole sections of that report, and I could go through the lead authors' reports in South Africa, the further reports from Kathmandu. I can go through sections of who makes up the actual lead authors in that. But this turns into this sort of parochial partisan process. I'm going to do and make sure I'm part of my nation, the commitments that we have made. That is my job. And we have met every commitment. In fact, with the Kyoto commitments, the reason they were met was not by urban Australia. Regional Australia met those commitments. We paid with them by the divestment of our property, the divestment of our vegetation rights. I'm not quite sure where you live, but I imagine it is in Canberra or Sydney. Which one?
Canberra.
Okay, your emissions went up. You are part of the problem. Regional Australia was part of the solution.
With respect, Mr Joyce, you're the government. This is the IPCC statement of the latest science. Sure, so I just want to know whether the starting point is that factual summation of the science.
And I've told you I'm not going to stand here and sort of be berated into complying with a thing that sounds awfully like the statements that one gives in regards to their child at a baptism, or it is I will work with the agreements our nation has made.
With respect, and I will, Mr Deputy Prime Minister, it sounds like you don't accept this science.
I've given you the premise of why. Because you basically came up with a sort of a whole litany of things and say, do you agree or are you some sort of retrobate? That is the inflection in your question. And I won't comply and participate in a debate like that.
Just to be clear, these are statements from the IPCC report.
I know that. I know it's the way you presented them, and I'm just telling you right now. It is my right to say what is my job as a politician, to comply with the agreements that we have signed up to. You asked me, do I agree that have humans had an influence on the climate? Yes. But I'm not going to participate in some sort of kangaroo court of now you will agree to every statement I say because the IPCC said it.
Mike Foley from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age.
Thanks for your speech, Mr Joyce. Mike Foley from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. On domestic policy matters specifically, Angus Taylor has committed to release a long-term emissions reduction strategy by November, at least ahead of the Glasgow conference. And, you know, in reference to Kyoto, you've said that the Nationals want to see the cost of any new policies before committing to any emissions deadlines. Can you fill us in? Are you working with Angus Taylor at the moment? Are the Nationals working with Angus Taylor? What progress is being made, and what are your priorities for that particular specific policy, please?
Well, we're making sure that what comes forward, because we're kind of bruised and beaten by the Kyoto process. So we're making sure that we don't double up. And we're making sure that what is suggested this time is something where urban Australia pays the price like regional Australia if there's a price to be paid. And if people come up with something that is a logical efficiency of the economy, for instance, what I was talking about, the Inland Rail will replace about every train's about 110 B doubles, 150 semi-trailers. Each one of those uses about 600 litres of diesel each in one section of the trip. That is an effective mechanism. Who would argue against that? You know, that is using logic. It's using technology. If you can make things work better, then and that is, to answer your question, that is the discussions people have. But once more, and this is why, in regards to the previous question, why we get so annoyed, because people say you must comply with my assertion, and that therefore justifies everything that I want to do next. Because otherwise I just go back to the initial statement and say, but didn't you say this? Therefore you must comply with that. And that's bullying. That's not negotiations, that's just straight out bullying. So that's why we always say, I must respect my colleagues in my party room, and if there was something put forward to us, we would take it back to them. It is the role of the politician to implement plans. It is not the role of a politician, because they don't have the requisite skills to develop plans. Plans are given to you by people who have competency in thermodynamics, who have competency in atmospheric science, who have competency in engineering. I mean, that competency is rare, if ever, found in a party room. But they will come forward with a plan, I've no doubt. And at that stage, we have a reason to have a discussion with our party room. And I would never, if I wanted to scuttle it, the best thing for me to say right now is you agree or not agree to it, because it is their right, and I intend to make sure they have that right to have that discussion.
How much, though, do you take into consideration? I appreciate your view about representing your constituents and things like that, but what about the views of, you know, Liberal MPs in the inner city who have constituents who care very much about climate change? What about what we're seeing happening in financial markets around the world, talk of trade barriers based on carbon tariffs and things like that? I mean, I appreciate, you know, that farmers are angry that they can't clear land like they used to, sort of thing. But, you know, the world is moving on, isn't it?
Well, this is a clear thing. We've also got to go back to the pragmatics of the Australian economy. As I said, we've got a major debt, and we've got to pay for it, and we've got to provide to the world what the world wants to get our terms of trade and get the money to keep this economy going. And if you want to know what the world wants, then the best place to determine that is to go to a port, to go to the port of Port Hedland. And it's quite obvious the world wants iron ore. But if you go to Hayes Point, you say the world wants coal. If you go to Gladstone, you see the world wants coal. If you go to Newcastle, you see the world wants coal. When the world decides to move on, then so do we. But if we turn that around and say, well, we're going to just stop putting things on a boat because we've made that decision, sort of arbitrary decision right now to do it, then if you're going to be authentic about that decision, you have to then turn around and say which hospital, because the money is not there, which hospital you intend to close, which pension do you intend not to raise, how you going that you don't think the NDIS should have the same length and breadth that it has now, that you affect your Defence Force, that you don't have the money for education or the money for doctors, for Medicare. You know, you've got to be, and if people say, oh no, I don't want that either, then you say you're being a child, because you're saying our biggest export in this nation is fossil fuels. It's just that you don't see it from the inner suburbs, but it's there. And if you say I'm going to close down the biggest earner for my family, but I want to live with the same standard of living I do now, then that's just a childish decision. So if this nation wants to deal with that, they said you have to substantiate, not just muse, not just hope for, but substantiate an alternate income source. And this nation hasn't done it, and there's no prospect in the near future that it's going to happen. If it does happen, it'll happen in parallel, and one will evolve and one won't. Now, so the answer is, if we had this discussion in the inner suburbs, I know I'll get one view. If I have it in Muswellbrook, I'll get another view. If I had it in central Queensland, you'll get another view. If I had it in the middle of Melbourne, you go back to the former view. Discussions evolve and are affected by what people see out their window.
You talked in Parliament, you mentioned this week in a question time that Inland Rail had the potential to be a great carbon abatement.
Yep.
If you had to put a percentage on doing a deal on net zero, what would you rate your probability?
Well, I don't know. Well, what I would suggest is anything you do, look, coming from the country, I can assure you one thing is, in any deal, I don't start by saying what I think it's worth. I start by saying how much do you want it.
Next question, Michael Keating.
Michael Keating from Keating Media, Deputy Prime Minister. How do you think COVID lockdowns will interrupt freight travel across Australia, and has any economic modelling been done to show the effect on the economy from that loss?
Well, I'd like to also commend the work of Scott Buckholtz. We had a ridiculous situation the other day up on the border where people were in their cabins of their trucks for days on end waiting for tests, and you know it just can't go on like that. It's having huge repercussions. And right now, West Australia is screaming out for agricultural workers, no doubt agricultural plant. They've got a crop, it's ripening in the paddock, people are staring at it. But the question that's going through their head is, how do I get this off? You've got to have not only header drivers, but you've got to have other material that comes in from the east, you've got to bring it in, you've got to move things around. And this is one of the consequences I don't think has been seen in this, that our economy, even in regional area, we don't operate as states. We operate as a nation. We're an economy that is smaller than the economy of California, smaller than the economy of Texas, all of a sudden breaking itself up into little Montanas. It's just really odd. And it's going to have real effect on how it works. So the answer to your question is yes, because we haven't designed this economy since Sir Henry Parkes to go back to where it was in 1890.
Got a couple of questions here from a couple of regular attendees who are in absentia because of the lockdowns. First question from Tim Shaw, Director of the Press Club here. The recent Delta outbreak in regional New South Wales has highlighted the inadequacy of sufficient frontline medical services available for regional communities, particularly for First Nations communities in New South Wales. What urgent steps is your government taking now to protect these vulnerable people?
Yeah, look, and you know, David Gillespie once more has been on some of the forefront of this. In our discussions, which happen nearly every day in regards to the COVID issue, we fought for and brought forward that chemists, pharmacies should also deliver the vaccines, because in many areas of those that you're referring to, there are pharmacies, not doctors. And with 4,000 pharmacies around Australia, this gives us 4,000 more venues to be able to deliver the vaccine. And in towns that don't have doctors, it gives us the capacity to deliver that outcome to them. Now, it's in other areas, it's the Royal Flying Doctor Service, where we're delivering the capacity to go into the really remote communities and actually meet there. Even this morning I was talking to the Mayor of Gundawindi and working out how we deal with them, what is a better process to deal with areas such as Toomala and Boggabilla. I've, in my life, lived in Werris Creek, Moree, Charleville, St George, and Danglema, which is an Aboriginal word, and I went to primary school in Aboriginal white area. That's where it was, Woolbrook. And it's got to be a different approach. It's got to be really one-on-one. And you can't sort of do it by ads. You've got to do it by on the ground, working with that community, and we are doing that. Like if you go to Walgett and see the rollout that's happening there, and commend the work of Mark Colton, who's also been part of this process. It's much harder than doing it in a city environment, but we are doing it. We are getting on with it. The rates aren't in those areas as good as they are in urban areas, in the capital cities, but they're within sight, and we've got to drive them forward. They're in sight now. They weren't a matter of months ago.
Thank you. And a question from Astrid Watts from University of Canberra Press Club. With suicide rates increasing nationwide due to such increases of isolation because of COVID restrictions and lockdowns, would you support the national call to increase funding for mental health services, especially within rural communities? We
have been increasing mental health funding, and even recently we had further announcing into such things as primary caregivers and mental health, and it's vitally important. So we're really calling to do more of what we're already doing, because Greg Hunt has been exceptional in the money he's driven into mental health services. It is incredibly important, and one of the sobering issues that we're dealing with now is the tragic, massive increase in suicides that we're seeing as a proportion of the base by reason of lockdowns, I'd have to say, and that is something that has to be taken into our assessment and statistics. Is the issues that are happening to people right now, and the mental health issues that are happening to people right now by reason of their isolation and their frustration, because the humankind is being a human is a collegiate experience, and it's got to mix with other people, and that's not happening, and it's causing real mental problems.
Thank you. Sarah Ison.
Just back on the borders, Clive Palmer is poised to launch a High Court case against WA and states like Queensland that are going to require a jab from people from New South Wales. Do you reckon that's fair enough? And do you share the view of Michaela Cash, who told the Oz that she thinks actually if such a case is launched, that such states will probably lose that case? What are your thoughts on all of that?
Well, I don't profess to be a lawyer, so what I say now comes to you as an accountant and a farmer. But look, we know that the nation has to start working as a nation again. I think we know that in the end things will turn around from, rather than Western Australia locking us out, they'll be locking themselves in, because the rest of the nation will just open up. And what other people do will be the same with Queensland. It'll be just up to them, but the rest of the place will be moving on and dealing with the issue. Section 92 of the Constitution, I think, is quite clear. It talks that you can't use any form of restriction, I think, in trade, commerce or intercourse, which is the people having the capacity to talk to themselves, talk to others. And if Section 92 is to be as it's read, then one would suggest as the vaccination rates go up, it'd be much harder for a state to argue the case of why they could close their border. Now, that subsequently, obviously, to our Constitution, states brought in their own legislative requirements, but they are subordinate to federal requirements. And the arguable case at the High Court the last time really based it a lot around that we were at the initial stages of dealing with the pandemic. There were vast differences and basically a lack of vaccination rates, but that's not the case. We're vaccinating nearly 2 million a week. 2 million a week now. 2 million vaccinations go out a week. And in New South Wales, 70% have had at least one inoculation. So it's a vastly different circumstances now if it went to court than it was the first time. But I don't think the Prime Minister will be partying himself to any case of Clive Palmer. In fact, I could almost bet my house on it.
Thank you. And our final questioner is Anna Henderson again.
pressure are you under from the UK and the US over climate policy? And is it a fait accompli that by the time we get to Glasgow, your government will commit to net zero by 2050?
Well, I mean, I can't talk for the whole of the government. I can talk for the Nationals on this issue. And we've been quite clear that, you know, we want details and the party, our party room, will make the decision. So a unilateral statement by me has no meaning because it requires the concurrence of the Nationals in the room. The UK has a vastly different economy to us. The financial sector of the City of London is a big driver. The US has a vastly different economy to us. The US has Microsoft, it has Boeing, it has General Motors. It is set up in a vastly different way. The UK financial services, mentioned pharmaceuticals, in the US as well. Our economy is this. Our biggest export is fossil fuels. And just near it, iron ore. Then daylight, 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 more daylight, some more daylight. Tertiary education was there, but COVID's caused real problems there. Agriculture, and to give you an understanding of agriculture, the barley exports are worth the equivalent of 3 days of iron ore exports. Our beef industry, which we love to death, is the equivalent of 40 days of iron ore exports, and our fossil fuel exports are bigger than the iron ore exports.
So what's your message?
So my message is that in discussions, that what we deal with, we have to understand what we sign up to. We have to understand the ramifications back to our economy. And to explain to the Australian people in that process, and I'm not saying the process is without merit, but explain to the Australian people not just their aspirations, because the Australian people are good and their aspirations are worthy, but they've got to understand the economic consequences, because all decisions come with consequences, and that is something that in discussions with, I imagine, and I'm not doing them, the Prime Minister is, but if I was having discussions with Prime Minister Boris Johnson or President Biden, I would have to also make them aware of what we can do and what we can't do, and the process of how we do it. It's to be frank, it's going to be vastly our circumstances in economics are vastly different to theirs, and so we have to be very mindful of how we do it. And that's why in that speech we talk about such things as rare earths, and working out, you know, if there's a process, we have to, and I said that in the speech, we have to substantiate it. We can't just wish for it. And a lot of discussions is wishing for things, but substantiating them and actually proving them up is completely different.
So are you then prepared to sacrifice some of the diplomatic goodwill with those countries in order to get what you want?
Well, you know, that's sort of hypothetical, but I think the circumstances that the United States of America are dealing with in a geopolitical way, and also Boris Johnson, are exactly the same as Australia's. That's where we have it. We have an exact parallel, and those circumstances have to be kept well in mind because it's important. Now, I know that the Prime Minister is giving his best endeavours to this process, and as I say, that my engagement is meaningless because it really comes with what the National Party room wants. So that is why I'm not, you know, launching myself out too far there, but away from just giving a quick instruction that where we start from is a vastly different place to where the United Kingdom starts from, or even America. I might just also add this, and this is where the complexities come in. All these things are not as simple as I see. A simple answer is generally the wrong one. If America has done very well in their carbon emission reduction by reason of fracking, gas fracking, a change of their whole source of fuel, that has real pushback in sections of Australia. We can go to renewables and expansion of wind towers, but even now, we've got even the Greens arguing against wind towers. Former leader of the Greens, both Bob Brown have argued now against wind farms in Tasmania. And you're getting protest groups in our own electorate that are arguing against. You go down to Nundle, and you can see it's just divided communities down the middle to Kentucky, to Walcott, other areas. And these people, when you talk to them, cover the political gambit from green to national. You know, and so it's not an easy solution. And even if you go into some sort of, if you expand on the morality of the circumstances of solutions, such as solar panels. Solar panels need polysilicons. There's probably about, I suppose, if they come out of China, there's probably a better than predominant probability, not possibility, that the polysilicons were there by reason of near slave labour by the Uyghur people, because that's where they make the solar panels, in Xinjiang province. And if you say, well, I'm talking about batteries, well, ion lithium batteries require cobalt. And the vast majority of the world's cobalt supply comes out of the Democratic, and it's not, Republic of the Congo, where you have child labour. And there's been congressional committees in the United States that have looked into these issues. So nothing is holistically good, and nothing is ultimately perfect. And when you think about it, if the polysilicates, which will definitely be on the roofs in Australia, that most definitely have been, in part of their construction, required slave labour, when you go and turn on the lights, do you think slave labour? And do you think, well, I've got to have a wider encompassing view on everything. Everything is not as simple as it initially seems.
With that, let's thank Barnaby Joyce, the Deputy Prime Minister.